Welcome to the Martial Archives podcast. I'm Dave Kipper. Every episode we dig through newspapers, magazines, and historical records to uncover the true stories behind the martial arts history. Some are legendary, others have been forgotten. Whenever the sources disagree, we'll examine the evidence together. So let's open the archives. Today we're traveling to Los Angeles in January 1926, where a young Japanese judoka named Setzuso Ota hoped to take the world title from one of the most controversial champions of his era. The advertisement in the lower right corner of the sports page read, "Ad Santel, World Jiu-jitsu Champion versus Professor Ota, Japan's greatest wrestler." The newspapers called him Professor Ota and hailed him as Japan's greatest wrestler. In 1926, that may well have been true. Setzuso Ota was 29 years old, and he was about to face Ad Santel, the self-proclaimed world jiu-jitsu champion, at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, California. Located at the corner of 18th Street and Grand Avenue in downtown Los Angeles, the Olympic had opened only a year earlier. Yet it was already becoming one of the most glamorous sporting venues in America. Nearly 11,000 spectators could fill its state-of-the-art arena, and celebrities such as Jack Dempsey, Charlie Chaplin, and Mary Pickford were frequent visitors. On Wednesday night, January 28, 1926, Ota carried more than his own ambitions into the ring. He believed the honor of the Japanese people rested on his shoulders, not only the millions back in Japan, but also the thousands of Japanese immigrants living along the west coast of North America. Ota had come to the United States more than a year earlier with a single purpose: to force Ad Santel into a title match. Santel was no fraud, a legitimate professional catch wrestling champion. He had toured Japan in 1921 and defeated a number of high-ranking Kodokan Judo black belts. After those victories, he began calling himself the World Judo Champion, a claim that gained attention on both sides of the Pacific during the era's highly publicized Clash of Styles challenge matches. Ota had studied those results carefully. He had defeated many of the same men Santel had beaten, and that convinced him that the championship could be taken. The rules seemed to favor both fighters in different ways. They would wear gi jackets, which suited Ota. Any holds were allowed, which suited Santel. For one full hour, the two men struggled under the bright lights of the Olympic Auditorium. The gi jacket snapped and flapped so violently that spectators often could not see the grips, the counters, or Ota's near successful submission attempts. When the hour expired, referee Tom Travers declared the bout a draw. Many in the crowd were baffled. Contemporary newspaper reports criticized the match for its slow pace and defensive tactics, noting the absence of a decisive fall. The audience had expected a dramatic victory. Instead, they witnessed a tense and cautious stalemate. Yet, the newspapers the next morning suggested a telling detail. Santel's throat was reported to be red and badly chafed both inside and out, evidence that Ota's attacks had come far closer to success than most spectators realized. Ota had not won the championship that night, but he had accomplished something almost as important. His star was rising. What was jiu-jitsu? This is where my history degree comes in. Before we continue Setzuso Ota's story, we need to answer a simple question. What exactly was jiu-jitsu in 1926? The answer is more complicated than you might think. The origins of Japanese jiu-jitsu are lost in the mists of history, but most historians agree that its roots lie on the battlefields of feudal Japan. Over centuries, samurai developed countless methods of armed and unarmed combat designed for the chaos of war. As Japan entered long periods of peace, those battlefield techniques evolved into formal martial traditions, each preserving its own methods, philosophy, and curriculum. Some schools gradually disappeared, others adapting to a changing Japan. The most influential of these new systems was created in 1882 by a young educator named Kano Jigoro. Drawing primarily from the Tenjin Shinyo-ryu and Kito-ryu schools of jiu-jitsu, Kano removed much of the striking and weapons training and instead emphasized randori, free practice against a resisting opponent. His goal was not simply to preserve old techniques, but to create a modern martial art that developed both physical ability and character. He called it judo. Judo quickly proved its worth. In a series of highly publicized tournaments organized by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department, Kano's students consistently defeated practitioners from many of the older jiu-jitsu schools. Those victories helped establish the Kodokan as Japan's premier martial arts institution and secured judo's place as the primary martial art taught to the Tokyo police. The objective of competitive judo was straightforward. Throw your opponent cleanly onto their back, hold them with a pin, or force them to submit with a choke or joint lock. Inside Japan, the newer name, judo, was becoming increasingly common. Outside Japan, almost everyone still called it jiu-jitsu, and they spelled it almost any way you can imagine. Jiu-jitsu, J-I-U-J-I-T-S-U. Jiu-jitsu, J-U-J-I-T-S-U. Jiu-jitsu, J-U-J-U-T-S-U. Jiu-jitsu, J-I-U-J-I-T-S-U. Sometimes even judo. To newspaper editors in the early 20th century, they often meant exactly the same thing. Whatever they called it, the Western world was fascinated. One newspaper proclaimed, headline, "Wonderful Jiu-Jitsu, the science which gives the little Jap superior endurance." The article went on to describe Jiu-Jitsu as Japan's national system of physical training and self-defense. It claimed the art had been carefully guarded by the Japanese for generations before finally being shared with the West. Readers learned that President Theodore Roosevelt had taken private lessons, that military academies were considering adopting the art, and that newspapers themselves were publishing instructional lessons so ordinary Americans could learn these mysterious Japanese techniques at home. To modern ears, much of the language sounded dated, even offensive. But the article perfectly captures how exotic and captivating Japanese martial arts appeared to Western audiences in the early 1900s. Jiu-jitsu had become a sensation. At the center of that movement stood the Kodokan. Setzuso Ota trained there under Kano Jigoro himself, earning the rank of 4th degree black belt during an era when ranks above black belt were still rare and personally overseen by Kano. Whether in the dojo or on the competition mat, Ota belonged to the first generation of Kodokan judoka to carry the art beyond Japan's shores. By the early 1920s, he had settled on the American West Coast, helping establish what would become the historic San Gabriel Judo Dojo in El Monte, California. More on that dojo later. He also spent time teaching and training in Tacoma, Washington, becoming one of the pioneers responsible for introducing Kodokan Judo to the United States. But teaching was only part of the story. The real excitement came from the challenge matches. Much like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu exploded in popularity during the early UFC events of the 1990s, Japanese Jiu-Jitsu captured the public imagination through contests between different fighting styles. Judoka challenged wrestlers, wrestlers challenged boxers, savate fighters met Jiu-Jitsu experts. Every style claimed superiority, and the only way to settle the debate was inside the ring. The rules varied from city to city. Sometimes gi jackets were worn. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes matches ended with throws. Others with submissions. Still others allowed pins, while certain contests continued until someone could no longer fight. Professional catch wrestlers and Kodokan judoka frequently crossed paths, and no rivalry was more famous than the one between Ad Santel and Japan's finest representatives. What was the world Setzuso Ota entered? A world where martial artists didn't just argue about which style was best. They wagered their reputations and sometimes entire careers on proving it. And in 1926, Ota believed he was the man who could take the self-proclaimed World Jiu-Jitsu Championship away from Ad Santel. But as we know, it would end in a draw. If Setsuso Ota's wrestling career was the making of a champion, then his marriage to Lucy Banning may have been the beginning of its unraveling. When newspapers announced their wedding, the headlines were impossible to ignore. Headline: Lucy Banning Ross, harbor heiress, and noted California beauty weds Japanese. To modern readers, Lucy Banning is almost forgotten. But in Southern California at the turn of the 20th century, she was one of the most famous women in America. Born on February 11, 1876, Lucy was the daughter of General Phineas Banning, the father of the Los Angeles harbor, and one of the wealthiest men in California. She inherited not only an immense fortune, but also a celebrity status that today's audiences might compare to a combination of Taylor Swift's fame and Madonna's ability to scandalize the public. I'll add a photo of Lucy Banning Ota to our social media sites. The newspapers could never seem to decide who Lucy really was. Some called her the most beautiful woman in California. Others described her as a peach, free-spirited, or simply man-crazy. Whatever the description, one thing was certain: people could not stop reading about her. Lucy had spent decades shocking respectable Victorian society. She eloped with her first husband, young attorney John Bradbury. For several years, the marriage seemed happy until one evening, after attending a party in Santa Monica, Lucy disappeared with another man, a married Englishman named Captain W. Russell Ward. Newspapers tracked the pair to a San Francisco hotel. Bradbury eventually located Ward and reportedly gave him an ultimatum: leave town within 24 hours. Ward did. Only days later, somewhere in Iowa, he stepped, or perhaps was pushed, from a moving train in the middle of the night. His death was officially considered an accident, but rumors of murder and suicide followed the story for years. Lucy divorced Bradbury and married actor Mace Greenleaf. That marriage failed. Then came newspaper reporter Robert E. Ross. That marriage failed as well. For years, she carried on a highly public romance with Charles Hastings, a wealthy Californian many expected would become her next husband. Instead, she chose someone no one saw coming, a Japanese professional wrestler. Exactly when Lucy and Setzuso Ota first met is difficult to determine. Contemporary newspaper accounts place their meeting aboard a ship crossing the Pacific in 1926, while Ota was returning to America during his campaign to challenge Ad Santel. Whatever the circumstances, their relationship developed quickly. For Ota, the romance came with enormous risks. California law still prohibited interracial marriage, forcing the couple to travel to Seattle to marry legally. Their wedding became an international news story, not simply because of Lucy's social standing, but because many newspapers considered the marriage itself controversial. The headlines emphasized their ages as much as their backgrounds. Lucy was 60. Ota was 31. Some newspapers called him a graduate of the Imperial University. Others described him as wealthy. Nearly all referred to him as Professor Ota, or Japan's greatest wrestler. To the public, it was another sensational chapter in Lucy Banning's remarkable life. To Ota, it appears to have been something much more personal. The newlyweds departed for Europe on an extended honeymoon. Then tragedy struck. While living in Florence, Italy, Lucy contracted pneumonia and influenza. On February 20th, 1929, she died. According to Ota, Lucy understood that she would not recover. Her final words reportedly were, "I'll get criticized for this too." She was 53 years old. Her body was returned across the Atlantic and buried beside her father in the Banning family plot at Rosedale Cemetery in Los Angeles, after funeral services attended by family and friends. Then came one final surprise. When Lucy's will was opened, it revealed that nearly her entire estate, worth between $300,000 and $500,000 US, an enormous fortune at the time, had been left to Setzuso Ota. The document had been drafted long before they were legally married. After a bequest of $40,000 to her attorney, Ward Chapman, Lucy left Ota her jewelry, personal belongings, automobile, household furnishings, and the proceeds from the sale of her real estate. Even more intriguing was a single sentence explaining the gift. To Mr. Setzuso Ota, in consideration of the great sacrifice he has made for me. The will never explained what that sacrifice was. The newspapers didn't know. Historians still don't know. But whatever promise Ota had made to Lucy Banning, she clearly believed he had earned both her trust and her fortune. By 1929, Setzuso Ota had lost far more than a wealthy wife. He had lost his closest companion. Whether grief, public scrutiny, or changing fortunes affected the trajectory of his wrestling career is impossible to prove. Yet after Lucy's death, the newspapers that once celebrated Japan's greatest wrestler mentioned him far less often. For a man whose rise had filled sports pages across America, the silence is almost as striking as the headlines that came before it. By the late 1920s, the newspapers had stopped writing about Setzuso Ota as one of Japan's greatest wrestlers. Instead, they were writing about courtrooms. When Lucy Banning Ota died in Florence, Italy, it appeared that Ota had inherited a fortune. Newspapers estimated Lucy's estate to be worth between $300,000 and $500,000. a staggering sum at the time, and no small change now. But inheritances are rarely as simple as newspaper headlines suggest. Lucy's family contested the estate. Lawyers became involved. Years of litigation followed. By the time the legal dust settled, the fortune that newspapers had promised Ota had largely evaporated. Instead of becoming a wealthy California landowner, Ota reportedly received only a fraction of what had once seemed certain. Whether financial hardship pushed him toward a different life is impossible to know. What is certain is that by the late 1930s, Setzuso Ota's name appears not in the sports pages but in the crime reports. To understand why, we need to visit another side of Los Angeles. Beneath the glamorous image of Hollywood existed an extensive underworld of gambling, bootlegging, political corruption, and organized crime. Within the city's Japanese American community, one organization dominated illegal gambling. The newspapers called it the Tokyo Club. By the late 1930s, the Tokyo Club had grown into a lucrative gambling syndicate, protected by an elaborate system of payoffs and police corruption. Illegal gambling houses continued operating because certain members of the Los Angeles Police Department allegedly warned operators before raids took place. In 1936, leadership of the organization passed to a powerful figure named Hideichi Yamatoda. Not everyone welcomed his rise. According to later federal prosecutors, rival interests began searching for a way to remove Yamatoda from power. According to later federal prosecutors, rival interests began searching for a way to remove Yamatoda from power. If the Los Angeles police could not be trusted to act against him, perhaps someone outside the city could. The plan they devised sounds less like a sports story than the plot of a film noir. On December 24th, 1938, Christmas Eve, Yamatoda was approached not by gangsters, but by police officers from El Centro, California, nearly 200 miles away. They informed him he was under arrest. The charges accused him of operating an illegal gambling enterprise in Imperial County. Because the arrest was carried out by uniformed officers, Yamatoda complied. According to the government's later case, the arrest itself was merely the opening act. Once separated from his associates, Yamatoda was transported east towards the Imperial Valley. During the journey, his captors allegedly demanded $20,000 in exchange for his freedom. Yamatoda refused. At one point, while traveling through the desert, he reportedly attempted to escape. The effort failed. His captors recaptured him and continued south. Eventually, they crossed the international border into Mexicali, Mexico. There, according to prosecutors, the conspirators hoped to isolate Yamatoda beyond the reach of California authorities while stripping him of control over the Tokyo Club and its lucrative gambling empire. If that was the plan, it unraveled almost immediately. Hideichi Yamatoda was simply too important to disappear quietly. Newspapers across California followed the bizarre story with fascination. The headline seemed almost unbelievable. Headline: New arrests hinted in kidnap puzzle. Headline: Who kidnapped who? Every day seemed to bring another contradictory account. One side claimed the affair centered on gambling interests. Another insisted it involved control of Japanese language motion picture concessions. Still others hinted at attempted murder, police corruption, and gang warfare. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger the story became. Eventually, the federal government stepped in. In September 1939, a federal grand jury returned indictments against 11 men, charging conspiracy to kidnap. Prosecutors alleged that the supposed arrest had been nothing more than an elaborate frame-up carried out under the color of law. The trial attracted widespread attention. Witnesses described Yamatoda leaving the El Centro police station handcuffed in the early morning hours of Christmas Eve. One police officer testified that Yamatoda accidentally dropped five $100 bills as he was being led away. Another witness claimed records were altered to disguise the time he had left the station. The defense challenged nearly every detail, but the jury was ultimately convinced. In August 1940, Setzuso Ota and several of his co-defendants were found guilty of conspiracy, the former Kodokan judoka, the man newspapers had once called Japan's greatest wrestler. The challenger to Ad Santel now stood convicted in federal court. Ota appealed his conviction to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The appeal failed. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. While thousands of Japanese Americans would soon find themselves imprisoned in internment camps after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Setsuzo Ota spent much of the Second World War behind the walls of McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary, not because of his ancestry, but because of his conviction in one of California's strangest kidnapping conspiracies. It is an extraordinary ending to an extraordinary life, or perhaps only another chapter in a story that still contains more questions than answers. The kidnapping conspiracy marked the end of Setsuzo Ota's public life. Before the case had fully run its course, Hideichi Yamatoda fled to Japan in April 1941 to avoid prosecution on separate federal charges involving bribery and conspiracy connected to police corruption in Los Angeles. Only months later, the world changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into World War II. Japanese American communities across the West Coast, through no fault of their own, were uprooted. Families, through no fault of their own, were forced into internment camps, and many of the vibrant judo clubs and martial arts organizations that had flourished in places like Southern California were disrupted or disappeared altogether. When Ota was released from prison, the world he had helped build no longer existed. He lived quietly for the next 2 decades before taking his own life in 1963. For many years, Setsuzo Ota was almost completely forgotten. His story survived only in faded newspaper clippings, court transcripts, and dusty government files scattered across archives. But history has a way of resurfacing. Today, the San Gabriel Judo Dojo, the club Ota helped establish more than a century ago, still welcomes students. Around the outer edge of its logo emblem are the names of the dojo leaders who shaped its history. The very first name is Ota, Setsuzo Ota. His life was remarkable. He was a Kodokan judoka trained during Jigoro Kano's lifetime, a pioneer of judo in the United States, a professional wrestler who challenged the self-proclaimed world jiu-jitsu champion, the husband of one of California's most famous socialites, and later a central figure in one of the strangest kidnapping conspiracies of the 1930s. His story reminds us that history is rarely simple. Heroes are flawed. Legends are often incomplete. And sometimes the most fascinating lives are the ones almost forgotten. Thank you for joining me as we open the Martial Archives. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the Martial Archives wherever you get your podcasts. It helps others discover the show and ensures you won't miss future episodes as we uncover more forgotten stories from martial arts history. Until next time, I'm Dave Kipper. Thanks for opening the Martial Archives with me.